So, Law 23 is concentrate your forces. This is from Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power. This is the foundation of my soul and spirit. That in addition to Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. So, in chapter 23, or the law, the 23rd law, concentrate your forces. Concentrate your forces. It begins, there's some story here about the goose and the horse, which I haven't read, but the transgression of the law. So concentrate your forces. This is about the kingdom of Wu. So the kingdom of Wu were attacking their enemies here and there, and the king liked all the fanfare because every time they got a victory, then the king would be really popular. But the king's chief minister and advisor, Wu Tzu Hisu, the kingdom of Wu is in ancient China, 6th century BC. So what is that, the 700 BCs or 600 BCs? It was, they were warring with the northern provinces of the Middle Kingdom. Anyways, the kingdom of Wu. The kingdom of Wu kept attacking their neighbors and attacking their neighbors, and the chief minister, Wu Tzu Hisu, was saying, hey, we need to stop doing it, you know. The barbarous state of Yue, Y-U-E-H, to the south, was beginning to notice that the kingdom of Wu's problems and had designed to invade. So the minister was like, you know, you need to fucking watch out. The year 490. 490, 6th century BC. So it'd be 490 BC, right? I don't know exactly the date, it doesn't matter. But the kingdom of Wu, that's how I'm going to remember this story from now on. The kingdom of Wu, they overextended themselves just like ancient Athens, just like the Roman Empire, just like the Soviet Union did. They overextended themselves and it actually made them weaker. So he also mentions Sun Tzu, if you're not in danger, do not fight. So the kingdom of Wu, in spite of the minister warning him, he sends his son to live into a different kingdom of Qi. So the chief minister and advisor, Wu Tzu Hisu, tried to tell the king that he was overextending his forces. He didn't listen. And when Wu Tzu Hisu sent his son out into safety in the kingdom of Qi, the king had looked at that as a sign of disapproval of the war, and therefore he betrayed the king. So the king ordered his chief minister, Wu Tzu Hisu, to kill himself. And so Wu Tzu obeyed, you know, his king, but before he plunged the knife into his chest, which is this fucked up, right? Well, you're gonna fucking diss me? Well, then fucking kill yourself. Stab yourself in the heart with a knife. And he's going to do it, but before he does it, he says that he wants his eyes to be torn out. And he tells the king this, tear out my eyes and fix them on the gate of Wu so that I may see the triumphant entry of Yue. Yue. Y-U-E-H. And so just as Wu Tzu Hisu had predicted, within a few years the Yue army passed beneath the gate of Wu. Barbarians surrounded the palace, and the king remembered his minister's last word, felt the dead man's disembodiment eyes watching his disgrace, unable to bear his shame. The king killed himself, covering his face, so he would not meet the reproachful gaze of his minister in his next world. So the king's minister tried to fucking warn him. Wu Tzu Hisu, he killed himself with a fucking dagger, and he says, put my eyes on the gate so that way I could see the triumphant entry of Yue, and eventually Yue comes in and takes over the kingdom of Wu. So the kingdom of Wu, this is a transgression of the law. Instead of concentrating his forces, they overextended themselves, and by overextending themselves it made them weak. And it made them weak, and then the kingdom of Wu was no more. So we shall remember the kingdom of Wu. The observance of the law is going to be about the Rothschild banking family. And the Rothschild banking family, they had some humble beginnings. They lived in the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt, Germany. But they realized this guy, Mayer Amschel. He was the first of the Rothschilds to accumulate wealth by lending money. So this man, I guess the patriarch, Mayer Amschel, realized that by concentrating your forces, you're able to have a lot of power. So he had 5 sons, and then when Mayer Amschel was dying in 1812, he didn't name a principal heir. He did not name one of his 5 sons the principal heir. Instead, he wanted the 5 sons to work together. And that's exactly what they did. And so one of them, Nathan, had already opened up a shop in London. James moved to Paris. Amschel remained in Frankfurt. Solomon established himself in Vienna. And Karl, the youngest son, went to Naples. With each sphere of influence covered, they could tighten their hold on Europe's financial markets. And so, unfortunately, though, they were, diffusing themselves. They had spread themselves out. And so they didn't want to do that. No diffusion, no division. So instead, they avoided this danger by excluding outsiders and concentrating their forces. The Rothschilds established the fastest courier system in Europe, allowing them to get news of the events before all their competitors. And so they had a virtual monopoly on information. Their internal communications and correspondence were written in Frankfurt Yiddish, and in a code that only the brothers could decipher. So they're speaking in their own language, and they're speaking in a way that only they would know. And so eventually, they concentrated their forces. They had spread out to the 5 different cities, the 5 brothers did, but they concentrated their forces through their communication systems and by speaking in Frankfurt Yiddish. So therefore, they understood each other, so they knew what the fuck was going on. And even the shrewdest bankers cannot find their way through the Rothschilds' maze, admitted a financier who tried to infiltrate the clan. So 1824, James Rothschild eventually decides that it's time to get married, which scared them because you're bringing an outsider into the family business. But instead, they do some weird incestual shit. Yeah, it's incestual. They chose the daughter of his brother Solomon, so he marries his niece, the daughter of his brother. But the brothers were excited because they got to keep the concentration of power, intact. And so they thought it was a perfect solution. Instead of bringing an outsider into the family business, well, just marry one of the family, right? And so James' choice now became family policy. 2 years later, Nathan married off his daughter to Solomon's son. In the years to come, the 5 brothers arranged 18 matches among their children, 16 of these being contracted between first cousins. So, yeah, that was, the Rothschilds are one of the most powerful banking family ever. And even though they were living in a time of upheaval, they were still able to, maintain their concentration of wealth and power. There's several more comments that he makes here. He quotes Schopenhauer. He says, intellect is a magnitude of intensity, not a magnitude of extensity. So it's value in quality over quantity. So you do your best and you do as best as you can. Not try to make a whole bunch of stuff, but just make, a magnitude of intensity. So just, Napoleon knew the value of concentrating your forces at the enemy's weakest spot, so concentrate your forces at the weakness of other people. There's a thing about Casanova here. When he was put in prison, and he tried to dig a hole in one of his cells, but then eventually they moved him to another cell, but he still maintained his focus, and he says, I always believed, he later wrote, when a man gets it into his head to do something, and when he exclusively occupies himself in that design, he must succeed whatever the difficulties, and that man will become Grand Vizier or Pope. So concentrate on a single goal, a single task, and beat it into submission. The fool flits from one person to another, believing that he will survive by spreading himself out. It's a corollary of the law of concentration. However, that much energy is saved and more power is attained by affixing yourself to a single appropriate source of power. The scientist Nikola Tesla. So Nikola Tesla ruined himself because he wanted to maintain his independence and not attach himself to anybody, in spite of J.P. Morgan himself offering him a position. And he offered him a rich contract, but he wanted to be independent, and that meant that he could depend on no single patroon. And then eventually, he was always having to toady up to about a dozen of them, and then later on he would realize his mistake. Michelangelo found his single source of power from Pope Julius II. Galileo found his single source of power from the Medicis. And there's this Richelieu. Richelieu discovered at the beginning of his rise to the top of the French political scene during the early 17th century. It wasn't King Louis XIII. It was his mother controlling things. His mother controlled King Louis XIII. And so, therefore, this Richelieu guy, Richelieu, no, it's French, but he found out that his mother was controlling things, so he attached himself to the mother, and then he was able to, move up through the ranks, being the perfect courtier, right? Or the courtier, I don't know, the fucking court, right? The people in the court. So, it's enough to strike oil just one time. All you need to do is strike oil once. Your wealth and power are assured for a lifetime. Prize intensity more than extensity. Perfection resides in quality, not quantity. And the reversal of the law, I could think of a couple of reversal of the laws. In Yahoo Falls, the massacre at Yahoo Falls in McCreary County, that's when all the Cherokee got together, and they got all the children together. They got all the older people and women who were still here because the Cherokee were getting slaughtered in southern Kentucky, and they were going to go to some guy's school in Tennessee. So they concentrated. They said, let's get all of our people together in one spot at Yahoo Falls, and then once we meet there, then we're going to go. Well, once they met in that one spot, that's when Hiram Big Tooth Gregory, one of Sevier's men, comes in and just exterminates and kills them all. So by concentrating their forces, they made themselves actually prone to attack and weakness, and so they got ambushed and they died. The one that he mentions here, the reversal of the law, and I want to, this kind of contradicts another law, which I'll mention here in a second, but the Caesar Borgia. So Caesar Borgia, he had derived his power from Pope Alexander VI, and the Pope was the one that gave Caesar Borgia his armies to fight with in the wars to wage in his name. When he suddenly died, maybe from poison, Pope Alexander VI, Caesar Borgia was good as dead. He made a bunch of enemies, so the protection of his father was no longer there. That's actually kind of even true of Henry Christophe, the third president of Haiti. He pissed off a lot of people, and then once he had a stroke and it paralyzed him to where he was almost incapacitated, he kills himself, and then the rebels eventually kill his son too 10 days later. So just like the Caesar Borgia and Alexander VI relationship, by concentrating your forces on, your single source of power, your single patroon, once they're gone, then you're left just naked as a jaybird. Either you have to protect yourself, or you have to find another source of power. And Leonardo da Vinci, there was a painter, he was saying that one guy, he would paint with just one perspective, and that wasn't good enough. But Leonardo da Vinci, he was an architect, painter, and he was an expert in warfare, sculpture, mechanics, and because he was diffused, he actually was a very interesting person, so it made his art even better. Another, the contradiction, it seems like a contradiction to me, is the don't have a fortress. Don't have a fortress, because by concentrating yourself into a fortress, you isolate yourself, and therefore you are prone to, sort of like, it wasn't a fortress, but it was sort of like the massacre at Yahoo Falls. So Law 18 says, do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. So I don't know about that one. I see the point on that one. So the fortress, a lot of these House of Hanover, House of Hanover was your King George's, King George III, King George 1, 2, 3. That's the House of Hanover. And then you had the House of Habsburgs. So the House of Habsburgs, from one house, from one lineage, one family lineage, they were able to carry power from one, member of the family to the next member. So from one house, one castle, one, family, they were able to hold, get power and then hold and maintain that power for many years. The point that he makes in Law 18 about not building fortresses to protect yourself is that the fortress, it's like, well, where's the enemy? Well, there's the fortress right there. There's where the big building is, so we know exactly where the enemy is, and so it's easier to go attack them. Whereas if I don't know how you could not build fortresses. Maybe if you had several fortresses or something, or don't fortify yourself, just have houses and be on the road. So it seems like a contradiction about not building fortresses and then concentrating your forces. How can you concentrate your forces without a fort, without a place to congregate? So that's law number 23, and yeah, and this is good. This is actually, this seems like a college fucking course that I could develop. Concentrate your forces. All right. Peace.